The morning sun had barely risen over Central Park when Officer Richard Parker began his usual patrol. His polished badge gleamed against his crisp blue uniform, but the shine couldn't mask the coldness in his eyes. As he rounded the corner near the old fountain, he spotted a figure huddled under a weathered blanket on a park bench. The man on the bench wasn't bothering anyone. His belongings, a worn backpack and a small cart filled with recyclables, were neatly tucked beneath the bench. Several park regulars, including Mrs. Chen, who fed the pigeons every morning, had often mentioned how polite and helpful the gentleman was, always cleaning up after himself and even picking up others' litter. But Officer Parker didn't see any of that. His eyes narrowed as he approached, hand resting unnecessarily on his belt. "Hey, you," he barked, causing several morning joggers to pause their routes. "This isn't a hotel." The sleeping figure stirred slowly, revealing a dignified older man with silver-streaked hair and tired eyes. "Good morning, officer," the man said softly, his voice carrying an unexpected warmth and eloquence. He began carefully folding his blanket, his movements deliberate and practiced. Officer Parker's partner, Officer Rodriguez, hung back uncomfortably. He'd seen this scene play out too many times before. Parker's unnecessary aggression towards certain people he deemed suspicious. Rodriguez watched as the homeless man maintained his composure, even as Parker began throwing rapid-fire questions at him. "Where's your ID? What are you doing here? How long have you been loitering?" Parker demanded, his voice growing louder with each question. The morning crowd had grown, with several people now recording the interaction on their phones. "Sir, I have my identification right here," the man replied calmly, reaching slowly into his pocket. But before he could retrieve anything, Parker grabbed his arm roughly. "He's reaching. Hands where I can see them," Parker shouted, though it was clear to everyone watching that the man posed no threat. Officer Rodriguez stepped forward, finally finding his voice. "Parker, take it easy. He's cooperating," Rodriguez said, but his words fell on deaf ears. Parker was already pulling out his handcuffs, reciting a list of questionable charges: trespassing, resisting arrest, suspicious behavior. As the man was being handcuffed, his weathered backpack fell open, spilling its contents. Among the basic necessities tumbled something unexpected: a small leather wallet with a golden insignia that caught the morning light. Mrs. Chen gasped from her usual bench, recognizing the symbol, but Parker was too busy roughly escorting his arrested subject to notice. The growing crowd of onlookers murmured in disapproval, phones recording every moment. A young law student who often studied in the park quickly dialed the public defender's office, knowing in her gut that something wasn't right about this arrest. Little did Officer Parker know, his morning power trip was about to backfire in ways he couldn't imagine, and the man he was so carelessly arresting would soon turn his entire world upside down. The simple leather wallet lying in the grass held a secret that would shake the entire police department to its core. The police station bustled with its usual morning chaos when Officer Parker dragged in his latest arrest. The homeless man walked calmly despite the unnecessary tight grip on his arm, his dignity somehow untouched by the rough treatment. The booking area fell unusually quiet as other officers watched the scene unfold. "Found this one sleeping in the park," Parker announced loudly, pushing the man toward the booking desk. "Resisting arrest and showing suspicious behavior." The desk sergeant, a veteran named Wilson with 30 years on the force, raised his eyebrows skeptically. He'd known Parker long enough to read between the lines. The homeless man stood quietly during processing, his weathered face showing no signs of the anger or fear most people display in handcuffs. Instead, there was something in his eyes, a quiet knowing that made Officer Parker increasingly uncomfortable, though he'd never admit it. "Name?" Sergeant Wilson asked, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "I believe Officer Parker hasn't allowed me to show my identification yet," the man replied softly. His voice carried an unexpected authority that made several officers look up from their paperwork. Even the rookie filing reports in the corner stopped to listen. Parker scoffed, roughly pulling the wallet from the plastic bag of collected belongings. Probably fake anyway, he muttered, tossing it onto the desk. The leather wallet landed with a soft thud, its golden insignia catching the fluorescent light. Sergeant Wilson's face changed the moment he opened it. He stood up so quickly his chair rolled backward into the file cabinet. "Officer Parker," he said slowly, his voice tight with controlled anger, "remove those handcuffs immediately." "What? Why would I?" Parker started to protest, but stopped short when he saw what Wilson was holding. There, alongside a pristine identification card, was a familiar gold badge, one that every officer in the room recognized instantly. The homeless man rolled his shoulders gently as the handcuffs came off. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said quietly. "Though I must say, this has been quite an educational morning." Around the room, officers who had been pretending not to watch were now openly staring. Officer Rodriguez, who had followed them in, stepped forward. "Sir, I want to apologize for not intervening sooner. I should have." The man raised his hand gently. "Your apology is noted, Officer Rodriguez, but it's not just about this morning, is it?" His words carried weight beyond the simple question. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. Sergeant Wilson cleared his throat. "Should I call the chief, sir?" "Not yet," the man replied, straightening his worn jacket with the same care one might adjust a judge's robe. "I believe Officer Parker, and I need to have a conversation first. One that's been a long time coming." He turned to face Parker, who had gone pale beneath his swagger. The morning light streamed through the station's windows, catching dust motes in its beam. In that moment, the power dynamic had shifted so completely that even the most junior officer could feel it. The man who'd been dragged in as a homeless vagrant now stood as something else entirely, living proof that appearances could be deceiving, and justice sometimes wore unexpected disguises. The booking room at the police station erupted into controlled chaos as word spread about their unusual guest. Officer Parker sat nervously in a corner, his usual confidence completely deflated. Sergeant Wilson was on the phone, speaking in hushed but urgent tones, while other officers tried to look busy while stealing glances at the scene unfolding before them. The fingerprint technician burst through the door, clutching papers in his trembling hands. "Sir," he addressed the room at large, "these prints match retired Chief Justice Thompson of the State Supreme Court." The papers fluttered as he handed them to Sergeant Wilson, who nodded grimly. The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. The man everyone now looked at with new eyes was no ordinary homeless person. He was one of the most respected legal minds in the state's history. Officer Rodriguez felt his stomach sink as he remembered every moment he'd stayed silent during Parker's harassment. 6 months, the former Chief Justice spoke, his voice carrying easily across the now silent room. 6 months I've lived among the homeless. Not because I had to, but because I chose to. He looked around the room, meeting each officer's eyes in turn. And in that time, I've seen things that would break your heart, and other things that would make your blood boil. The station's chief of police burst through the door, slightly out of breath. He'd clearly rushed over the moment he got the call. "Your Honor," he started, but the former judge raised his hand. "Please let me finish," he said quietly. "What happened this morning wasn't an isolated incident. Officer Parker didn't just happen to have a bad day." He turned to face Parker directly. "You've been targeting homeless people and minorities for months. I know because I've watched you do it. I've seen you harass people who had nowhere else to go, people who needed help, not handcuffs." The chief of police's face grew darker with each word. Parker seemed to shrink further into his corner. But the former judge wasn't done. "But here's what gives me hope," he continued, gesturing to Officer Rodriguez. "I've also seen officers who struggle with their conscience, who know right from wrong, but feel powerless to speak up. And I've met countless citizens who showed kindness to a stranger they thought was just a homeless man." He reached into his worn backpack and pulled out a small notebook. Every incident, every act of kindness or cruelty, every abuse of power, it's all documented here, with dates, times, and witnesses. The notebook looked ordinary, but everyone in the room understood its explosive potential. I didn't do this to shame the department, he explained, his voice softening. I did it because sometimes real change needs more than just statistics and reports. It needs a story that can't be ignored, evidence that can't be dismissed, and truth that comes from experiencing it firsthand. The chief of police stepped forward, his face a mix of emotions. Your Honor, I give you my word, this will be addressed. He turned to Parker. Officer, hand over your badge and gun. You're suspended pending a full investigation. As Parker slowly unpinned his badge, the former judge watched with sad eyes. This isn't the end, he said to the room at large. This is just the beginning of the real work we need to do. 6 months earlier, life looked very different for the former Chief Justice. He sat in his elegant home office, surrounded by law books and framed photographs, staring at his resignation letter. His wife's passing had changed everything. She'd spent her life running a homeless shelter, and her last words still echoed in his mind. The system needs to see them as people first. That night, he made a decision that shocked his colleagues. He would step down from the bench, not for retirement, but for a mission. He remembered the conversation with his trusted clerk. I need to understand their lives, not just their legal cases. The transformation began slowly. He sold his car, donated most of his belongings, and kept only what he could carry. His expensive suits were exchanged for second-hand clothes. He grew out his beard and practiced stooping his shoulders, learning to become invisible in plain sight. His first night on the streets was a harsh awakening. The concrete bench felt like torture, and the constant noise made sleep impossible. A young woman nearby cried quietly, clutching her backpack like a shield. He learned later that she was a former teacher, laid off and evicted after medical bills drained her savings. Each day brought new lessons. He met veterans struggling with trauma, families living in cars, and college graduates who'd fallen through society's cracks. He kept detailed notes in his journal, not just about police interactions, but about the daily struggles, the closed public bathrooms, the hostile architecture designed to prevent sleeping, the suspicious stares from passersby. Some moments stood out sharply. There was the restaurant owner who'd slip him fresh coffee every morning, not knowing his true identity. The librarian who never questioned when he spent hours reading law books, despite his appearance. And the street artist who shared his food, saying, "We look after our own here." But there were darker moments too. He witnessed other officers like Parker, who seemed to enjoy wielding power over the powerless. He saw how quickly people turned away when violence happened, how easily brutality could be dismissed when the victim was homeless. He documented everything meticulously, building a case far stronger than any he presented in court. His hands, once soft from office work, grew calloused from life on the streets. His skin weathered under the sun, but his mind remained sharp as ever, recording every injustice, every small kindness. The hardest part wasn't the physical discomfort or the hunger. It was watching the system he'd served for decades from this new angle. Laws he'd interpreted from the bench looked different from the ground. The theoretical protections he believed in crumbled against the reality of daily life on the streets. When Officer Parker approached him that fateful morning, the former Chief Justice knew this was the moment he'd been waiting for. Everything he'd learned, every story he'd collected, would finally serve its purpose. The transformation from respected judge to invisible homeless man was about to come full circle, and justice would wear a very different face. The morning news hit like a storm. Cell phone footage of Officer Parker's arrest played on every local channel, showing the shocking moment he handcuffed the former Chief Justice. Social media exploded with clips from different angles, each one more damning than the last. Breaking news. Decorated judge exposed police discrimination through undercover investigation. The headlines screamed. The body camera footage released by the police department under mounting public pressure, painted an even grimmer picture. The audio captured every slur, every prejudiced comment Parker had made that morning. The police station's phone lines were jammed with reporters seeking comments. Outside, a crowd gathered. Homeless advocates, civil rights groups, and citizens who'd witnessed similar injustices. They carried signs reading "Justice for All" and "End Police Harassment." Local news interviewed Mrs. Chen, the pigeon lady from the park. "He was always so kind," she said, tears in her eyes. "Every morning, he helped me clean the park. I never knew he was a judge. He treated everyone with respect, unlike that officer." The story spread beyond local news. National networks picked it up, featuring interviews with legal experts who praised the former Chief Justice's brave investigation. "This isn't just about one bad officer," a civil rights attorney explained on air. "This exposes a systemic problem that needs addressing." At City Hall, officials scrambled to respond. The mayor called an emergency press conference, promising a complete review of police practices. The police chief stood beside him, looking grim as he announced an internal investigation into all of Parker's past arrests. Social media buzzed with stories from others who'd encountered Parker. A college student posted about being harassed while helping at a homeless shelter. A retired veteran shared his own run-in with the officer. Each story added fuel to the growing fire. The former Chief Justice watched it all unfold from a modest hotel room, provided by the police department as a temporary solution. He changed back into a suit, but his eyes still carried the weight of his 6-month experience. Local news stations competed for his first interview, but he declined them all, focused instead on preparing his detailed report. "This isn't about revenge," he told the police chief in a private meeting. "It's about reform. These people, the ones sleeping on benches, living in shelters, they're not just cases. They're human beings who deserve dignity and respect." As the day ended, the story had reached millions. Videos of the arrest had gone viral, sparking nationwide discussions about police conduct and homelessness. Parker's badge lay on the chief's desk, a symbol of the changes to come, while across the city, people began looking at their homeless neighbors differently, wondering what stories lay behind their weathered faces. Internal affairs took over the entire 3rd floor of police headquarters. Boxes of files lined the walls. Every arrest Parker had made in his 15 years on the force was under review. The investigation team worked around the clock, their faces growing grimmer with each file they opened. "Look at this pattern," the lead investigator pointed to a wall of data. Over 80% of his arrests involved homeless people or minorities. Most cases were dismissed for lack of evidence. She shook her head, adding another red pin to the map showing arrest locations. The former Chief Justice's notebook proved invaluable. His detailed observations provided context that the dry arrest reports lacked. He documented conversations, witnessed interactions, and even recorded badge numbers of officers who stood by silently during Parker's misconduct. Officer Rodriguez sat nervously in the interview room, his confession pouring out. "We all knew something was wrong," he admitted. But Parker had friends in high places. Anyone who spoke up found themselves working the worst shifts or passed over for promotion. The investigation expanded beyond Parker. Text messages revealed a network of officers who covered for each other, deleted body camera footage, and coordinated stories after questionable arrests. The Chief Justice's meticulous notes helped crack their careful code words and seemingly innocent messages. The police chief aged visibly as each new report landed on his desk. His own leadership was now under scrutiny. How had he missed the signs? Or had he chosen to ignore them? The weight of his responsibility pressed down like a physical force. Community members came forward with their stories. A shelter worker brought security footage showing Parker harassing residents. A shop owner shared recordings of the officer demanding free meals in exchange for protection. Each piece added to the growing puzzle of corruption. The district attorney's office began reviewing old cases. Dozens of Parker's arrests were flagged for immediate review. People who'd been convicted based on his testimony suddenly had hope for appeals. The ripple effects of the investigation touched hundreds of lives. The former Chief Justice spent hours in meetings explaining his experience and observations. His words carried extra weight now. He wasn't just speaking as a judge, but as someone who'd lived the reality of those affected by police misconduct. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Parker wasn't just a bad apple. He was a symptom of a deeper problem. The system that had protected him ignored complaints against him and promoted him despite red flags needed to change. And now, finally, that change seemed possible. The city council chamber was packed tight as the former Chief Justice took the podium. He looked different now, clean-shaven, in a pressed suit, but his eyes still carried the wisdom of the streets. The room fell silent as he began to speak. I stand before you not just as a former judge, but as someone who's seen our system from both sides, he began, his voice steady. For 6 months, I was invisible. I was one of the people you walk past without a second glance. And what I learned changed everything I thought I knew about justice. He opened his notebook, worn from months of street life. This isn't just about Officer Parker. This is about changing how we see and treat our most vulnerable citizens. The council members leaned forward, captivated by his words and the weight of experience behind them. He outlined his proposal for police reform. Mandatory sensitivity training led by homeless individuals themselves, regular community engagement programs, and a new oversight committee that included former homeless citizens. But he didn't stop there. We need housing first, he insisted. I've met brilliant minds living in doorways because one medical bill destroyed their lives. I've seen families sleeping in cars because rent became impossible. Arresting people for being poor isn't justice, it's cruelty. The room erupted in applause when he shared plans for converting an abandoned city building into a comprehensive resource center. It's not enough to offer a bed for the night, he explained. People need job training, mental health support, and most importantly, dignity. Officer Rodriguez stood to speak next, his voice shaking slightly. Working with the new community engagement program has opened my eyes, he admitted. Last week, I helped a homeless veteran fill out housing applications instead of writing him a ticket. That's real police work, helping people, not harming them. The changes spread beyond the police department. Local businesses that had once called police on homeless people now offered water and restroom access. The library started a job search program. Even the park where everything began had transformed. New benches replaced the old ones designed to prevent sleeping. The former Chief Justice worked tirelessly, moving between meetings with city officials and visits to homeless camps. He'd become a bridge between two worlds, using his unique perspective to create real change. His experience on the streets gave him credibility with the homeless community, while his legal background helped him navigate the system. This is just the beginning, he told a group of new police recruits during their community training. Real change happens when we stop seeing uniforms and stereotypes and start seeing people. Every person has a story. Every life has value. And true justice means protecting everyone, especially those who need it most. The courthouse was silent as Officer Parker stood before the judge. The same halls where he once strutted confidently now felt cold and imposing. The Internal Affairs investigation had uncovered years of misconduct, racial profiling, and abuse of power. Now was the moment of reckoning. The prosecutor laid out the evidence methodically. Years of falsified reports. Dozens of wrongful arrests. Countless instances of harassment captured on body cameras and civilian phones. But most damning were the text messages showing how Parker and his allies had systematically targeted vulnerable citizens. Your Honor, the prosecutor said, this isn't just about one man's prejudice. This case represents a breach of public trust that has damaged countless lives. She held up the former Chief Justice's notebook. We have documented proof of deliberate targeting of homeless individuals and minorities. The public gallery was packed with faces Parker recognized, people he harassed, arrested, or threatened. But they weren't here for revenge. They were here to see justice served properly, through the system rather than spite. Officer Rodriguez testified about the culture of silence that had protected Parker. We were taught that loyalty to fellow officers came first, he explained. But real loyalty means standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. The evidence was overwhelming. Body camera footage showed Parker planting evidence, harassing innocent people, and bragging about his actions to other officers. His own text messages revealed his prejudices in stark detail. When Parker finally spoke, his arrogance had vanished. "I thought I was doing my job," he said weakly. "I thought." But he couldn't finish. For the first time, he seemed to realize the weight of his actions. The judge's verdict was clear and firm. Parker would face criminal charges for civil rights violations. His police pension was revoked. He was barred from ever serving in law enforcement again. But the sentence came with a unique condition. "You will spend the next year working at the new Homeless Resource Center," the judge declared. "Not as punishment, but as education. You need to see the humanity in the people you once terrorized." As Parker was led away, the former Chief Justice watched from the back of the courtroom. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability and change. The real victory wasn't Parker's punishment, but the system finally working as it should, protecting those who needed protection most. 1 year later, the city had transformed. Outside the newly opened Justice and Dignity Center, formerly an abandoned warehouse, a crowd gathered for the anniversary celebration. The building's bright facade featured a mural painted by local artists, showing hands of different colors joined together. The former Chief Justice stood at the podium, looking out at faces that had become familiar during his months on the streets. But they looked different now. The teacher who'd lost everything to medical bills now ran the center's education program. The veteran he'd met in the park worked as a peer counselor. These weren't just success stories, they were proof that change was possible. 1 year ago, we witnessed how prejudice could poison even those sworn to protect us, he began. Today, we celebrate not just a new law, but a new way of thinking. He gestured to the police officers mingling comfortably with the crowd, their new community service uniforms designed to appear less intimidating. The Thompson Law, as people called it, had revolutionized police training and homeless outreach. Every new officer now spent 2 weeks living in shelters, working alongside the homeless community. The us versus them mentality was being replaced by understanding and compassion. The resource center buzzed with activity. Job training classes were full. The medical clinic offered free care. The legal aid office helped people navigate the system that had once seemed designed to trap them. Even Parker, who started his community service with reluctance, had slowly changed. Now he volunteered at the center even after his required hours were done. Officer Rodriguez, recently promoted to community outreach captain, shared success stories. Arrest rates had dropped while successful housing placements soared. The money saved on unnecessary arrests now funded rehabilitation programs. Other cities were starting to adopt their model. Local business owners reported positive changes too. The coffee shop owner, who'd once called police on homeless people, now ran a job training program in her cafe. The librarian has started a storytelling project, recording the lives and experiences of those who'd lived on the streets. The former Chief Justice looked at his old notebook, now preserved in a display case at the center. "This isn't the end of our journey," he said, his voice strong with conviction. "But we've proven that real change is possible when we see each other's humanity. Every person has value. Every life matters. And true justice means ensuring dignity for all." As the celebration continued, new faces mixed with old. People who'd once crossed the street to avoid each other now shared meals and stories. The park where it all began had become a symbol of community rather than division. And somewhere in the crowd, a young police recruit listened and learned, understanding that her badge meant serving everyone, not just those society deemed worthy.